I am in admiration of people who write novels. It must be so difficult to get into the head of the character and behave like them without showing our unconscious biases or stereotyping them. If you are a South Asian 40-year-old, are you able to think like a 70-year-old white English woman and give her an authentic, honest voice? Would you be accused of being racist? This is Stories Seldom Told. I am Smitha Tharoor. I'd like to introduce Ayisha Malik. Ayisha is the author of the Sofia Khan novels, This Green and Pleasant Land, and most recently, The Movement. In fact, I've read The Movement. Ayisha was also the winner of the Diversity Book Awards 2020. Plus, she teaches creative writing for the academies Faber as well as Curtis Brown. Ayisha lives in London, and I'm not sure where she's got time to do anything else between writing books and teaching creative writing and so on. But I'm sure that Ayisha has many stories to share with us around unconscious bias. So thank you so very much for joining me today, Ayisha.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, we're talking unconscious bias, as you know. And I'm just curious to know what you understand by that before we even think about what your stories sound like and look like.
Yeah, I think it's a good question because I was thinking about this before I came to speak to you, and what is my understanding. I didn't want to search for the Oxford Dictionary definition, more about my own perception of it. And I guess for me, it's about historical, environmental factors that have sort of been absorbed by one's own psyche and manifests in biases in real life, which you don't realize you're doing, based on what you perceive a person or a situation to be because of your own personal experiences. That's rather a long-winded explanation.
No, it's not. But I'm going to pick on one word that you said, which was historical. So are you saying historical in terms of history, or are you talking about historical in terms of your personal history?
I think both, actually. Personal history, because we're products of the environment in which we've been nurtured, and history as well, I guess, now that you bring it up, because we're taught history from a certain lens, and so we adopt those ideologies. And how do those ideologies then play out in day-to-day living?
Can you expand on what that means? Just for all of us to understand that.
Say, for example, oh gosh, I'm going to have to think of something, something that we're taught in school, for example. Okay, so we're taught about the Second World War in school, and the way that evolved and unfolded. And so I guess when we have conversations about the Second World War, we look at it from a specific lens. And so that sort of history colors our lens, but also then our personal experiences and current contemporary conversation plays a part in coloring our lens as well.
Now, it makes so much sense. Actually, coincidentally, not Second, but First World War film, All Quiet on the Western Front, I happened to see it yesterday.
Oh.
But of course, if you haven't read the book or seen the film, it's very much the story of World War I from the German perspective. And whatever you would have studied in school growing up in England would have been obviously from the British perspective, where the Germans are the bad guys. And it just, so I completely understand what you're saying, because it is so coincidental, and that's still very much in my head, the idea of the lens that we are brought to understand and believe is the right lens. That's what you're saying.
I always used to get my back up in school when they used to talk about communism and the Cold War in America specifically. And I always thought, well, what's so bad about communism? What's so bad about Marxism? And it's just interesting that to learn about a certain way that the nation, specifically the USA, saw communism, and how people were brainwashed, really, and in the same way that people in communist countries are brainwashed. But I saw there was this disparity in the way a certain culture was allowed to have this opinion and another culture was not allowed to have the same opinion, if that makes sense.
Entirely, entirely. And the idea of being brainwashed and no, I mean, you're making so much sense, Aisha, because the idea of being brainwashed and the idea of us not questioning, that's what you're saying, aren't you? We don't question the
Absolutely.
narrative that's put around us. This is bad, that is good. I'm being very simplistic in my language. And then we're not able to see it any differently. And you
No,
were questioning that.
yeah, but I think we lack perhaps I mean, I don't know. When I was growing up in school, I don't know if critical analysis was really pushed. And so I had a very personal reaction to certain things that were just part of my nature, I guess, to sort of think, well, actually, why is this a bad thing? You know, why are we seeing it from this perspective? But I don't think that sort of thinking is necessarily nourished in our society. And of course, then media comes into play, and and I think we're all in a situation where we are being taught to think a certain way. And it's very difficult to sort of step away from that and have one's objectivity.
Hmm. So perhaps you can kind of tell us a story, Aisha, for us to understand what you're saying, because there's a lot in what you've just said. And
Yeah,
I'm sure a story will reflect that better.
I think it's a very personal story about when I first started writing, actually. And both I have two stories, and they're both related to the writing. One of them is, so when I began to write my first novel, I started a sort of literary fiction, writing a literary fiction book, and I couldn't get past writing that sort of 18,000 words, and it took me 3 years to write 18,000 words, which is a very long time. And I sort of had ideas about, you know, it being a literary masterpiece, and I can tell you now, Smitha, it was not. It was quite shit. Um, I think one of the things I now look back on is, why was I doing that? And I wonder whether it was because I was a brown woman writing in a space that was predominantly white. And what I saw of brown writers out there was mostly literary fiction. And I think I had kind of, without realizing, stopped myself from actually exploring the voice that came naturally to me, in order to fit into this kind of mold. And then, you know, I dumped the literary fiction, and I ended up writing Sofia Khan is Not Obliged, which is essentially a rom-com in my kind of own voice, and a more of a mass market book than it is literary fiction. And I think that was probably one of the most kind of significant aha moments, if you like, I had in life, where I realized, actually, I don't, why do I think I have to write this way in order to be published, in order to have a voice as a female woman of color?
And there are quite a few Sofia Khan novels, is that correct?
There are,
Half
yeah,
a dozen or something.
no, there are two Sophia Khan novels.
Okay.
There is one short, quick reads I wrote as well. So there are three in
There are
total.
three. There are
Yeah.
three. And then Sofia Khan. And of course, I want to state the obvious. You're talking about a rom-com of somebody, and by her surname I can tell, who is a Muslim woman.
Yes, a Muslim hijabi woman.
Aha.
Yes.
So I mean, but that's so interesting in itself because you're quite deliberately challenging the status quo, aren't you?
Yeah, oh, 100%. Because I was and am so bored of watching stuff on TV and reading books in which you know, Muslim women are either oppressed, or there are honor killings, or they're submissive, or they're, you know, liberated, quote unquote, liberated by the Western world, and abandon their headscarf, abandon their beliefs. And I was just tired of all that, and I was also tired of all the seriousness. You know, I wanted to write a comedy. I wanted to write something with depth, but also with humor, because I think that comedy is an excellent vehicle through which you can kind of bridge communicate, bridge misunderstandings. No one wants to be lectured to in a book. And I felt that that was a good way of just showing a normal hijabi's life living in London without having to be so worthy and serious about it. It's not an issues book, and I didn't want it to be an issues book, even though.
But because of the fact that we're talking about stories of unconscious bias, I'm thinking about going back to when you first said, that you had these aspirations. And of course, I understand that the reason, your instinct, your unconscious, was that you looked around you and you can name many very well-known literary writers who are brown. Salman Rushdie, for example, most recently, who was injured, sadly, or Amitabh Ghosh, or many other people.
Yeah.
And so you felt that was the way to do it. But then my question to you, in terms of actually waking up and realizing that's not what I am, was there an aha moment?
That's not what I am in terms of a literary writer.
Yes, yeah. And so you started again.
It was.
So why? What gave you that resolve and that understanding about yourself?
I think it was time and distance, and not being able to push past that sort of word count, and realizing that actually your voice is unique to you, and you can't try to imitate what's around you. When you try to imitate or push yourself to be something other than what you are, you're sort of setting yourself up for a bit of failure, aren't you? I mean, failure in the sense that I learned from it, and we learn from our failure. So it was a positive thing in the end. But it was more about embracing the voice I had. But that had its own pitfalls as well, because kind of moving on, when I wrote Sofia Khan, I wrote it very much from a sort of place of personal experience, and also it's fiction, but there were a lot of my own personal experiences, and in that sense you could call it authentic, although I don't know if anything is truly authentic to everyone. Authenticity is merely your own, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when the book was published, I got really positive reactions most of the time. But I did get some people commenting on the fact that I painted South Asian men in a really bad manner. And I got a lot of criticism for that. And I was like, oh, actually, I think my own sort of dating experiences really informed unconsciously the way I then depicted South Asian men in my book.
Yeah, it was your experience, right? It was your reality.
It was.
And it could be somebody else who thinks South Asian men are the cat's whiskers or the knees bees or whatever the phrase is. But clearly you did not. So
clearly I didn't. But it raises some interesting questions about the sort of obligations upon the writer to do justice to characters and to the society they're in. And for me, I really took that on board, because if you as a writer are letting all your personal experiences sort of mar the way in which you approach your writing, that can end up being a bit of a dangerous thing, I think.
Well, there's another way of looking at it, which perhaps is not what you meant to say, but it's what I'm understanding, which is, how honest can we be as writers? Because are we allowed to? This is your honesty. This is your experience.
Yeah.
So if you are not, I mean, we know it's fiction. So you fictionalize. I mean, we all over the world, people are hearing this interview, would have heard of the television series called The Crown, which is about the royal family. Now, at the beginning of every season, they say it is not true. It is fictionalized. But yet we all end seeing whatever you've seen, having firm beliefs of how the queen or the king or whoever it is that's shown in the crown, have conversations or behave. So equally, when we're talking about you writing a story, which was, to be fair to you, your experience, and perhaps, and I'm putting words in your mouth, you don't have to agree with me, you've not had amazingly positive experiences with South Asian men. Perhaps there are many women around the world who will wag their finger at you and say, excuse me, you're wrong. They're the best thing. And I like them a lot. But equally, there'll be many people who agree with you.
Yeah,
So, and it's a fiction. Hang on a minute.
yeah, go on.
Why can't you write what you want to write?
This is a really interesting point you're making, because in many ways you're not wrong. But um I think what it is about perpetuating certain stereotypes that might fall in line with one's, and in this instance, my experience of things. But I've also met nice South Asian men. They've not all been dogs, right? Don't get me wrong.
Good thing you and I are both South Asian talking to each other. We're in a safe place.
Yeah, I've met many South Asian men that actually are lovely and great and inspiring even. And so I think it's more about perpetuating these stereotypes which in a sort of dominantly white culture can be problematic.
That's fair. I get that. I get that. Yeah, no, I understand that. You want to kind of at least try and not perpetuate stereotypes in any community, and
Absolutely.
especially if it's your own.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, in any community, which is why it's so important to really dig deep into your unconscious bias as a writer, because I'm not only now writing about brown people, I have white characters, I have black characters, and it really forces me to think twice about how I'm writing people from these various communities, because I have to do the characters justice. And whilst they are in a kind of uh, their background, their ethnicity, their religious beliefs, their sexuality will all inform part of who they are, I can't rely on stereotypes, can I? Because
Of
that's
any kind. Yeah, you're so right.
of any
Because,
kind.
but I mean, that's the beauty of being a writer, because it's about making them whole,
Yes,
and showing them with different aspects and personalities and different nuances in that human being, whether
absolutely.
white, black, Muslim, South Asian, whatever it might be.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I have to be really conscious of when I'm writing, especially when I'm writing about communities outside the South Asian.
No,
Um,
I understand that. You were saying that you have another story that's kind of connected to this. What would that be?
oh, so no, so that was the me writing about brown men being awful in Sofia Khan.
Right. But you know that
I
I have read the movement, Aisha, and I'm for those of you who have not read it, I would certainly suggest that you do, because I found it, and I don't want to give away the story, but very simply put, it is about the idea, and it's your book, your novel, Aisha, so you're more than welcome to correct me, but it's my take on it.
yeah.
It's the idea of how human beings need to understand themselves and appreciate who they are, rather than constantly playing the game, in inverted commas, and fitting into the expectations of society.
Mm,
And therefore, one character starts the movement of
mm.
taking a vow of silence.
Yes,
So,
yes.
what's that about? What
So
kind of unconscious biases do you have, or did you have, that motivated you to write a book like that?
yeah, it's so the she takes a vow of silence, and then this idea catches fire, and people around the world start going silent until the world is split into two factions of verbals and non-verbals. And because of this, social economic structures begin to crumble. And really, I just admit that I just had a lot of questions about the culture of noise we live in. And I was also a bit fed up of people just constantly having opinions, which to me, there was something jarring about the way people were jumping on, or do jump on bandwagons, but, and offer their opinion on absolutely everything and have a take, and it's all black and white. And I felt like all this noise is, you almost can't hear yourself think, which is why the idea of silence came about. And I wanted to really interrogate this notion, especially for women, for whom, historically speaking, having a voice, and even now, having a voice is so important, but also the idea of having a choice in that. And I feel that often we're sort of cajoled into saying what we think when our own opinions aren't even yet fully formed.
That's a very good point. I should have added that, because I saw that very much. I saw this book as a feminist book. I'm not saying that men shouldn't read it. I think men and women should read it. But that the idea of the power of the woman,
Yes.
and to take our own power.
Yeah.
And I absolutely felt that too. And I should have added that when I was talking about it. But may I ask, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but do you have a story that maybe that you felt that perhaps you were muzzled when you were little? I don't know. Is it that simple? What made you want to write a book like this?
That's a good question, and perhaps it's vaster in scope than I can really talk about right now. But I think it's I've always enjoyed silence, but in many ways, but I've also witnessed it in negative ways. And the impetus for me really was just honestly just wish. Am I allowed to swear on this podcast?
Go for it.
I just wished everyone would shut the fuck up, because I really was tired of all the noise. And so I decided to write this story about a woman who decides to take her own advice and she just shuts the fuck up. But it's also a journey of self-understanding for her, and really trying to understand why she's chosen silence when she has quite a fettered history, and coming to terms with who she is. And she's only able to really do that once she's allowed that space to be alone and to reflect. And I think one of the things about unconscious bias, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because you are, after all, the expert, but I wonder whether we suffer from these more because we don't actually have a chance to self-reflect.
Without a question, Ayisha. Yeah. Without a question, because the whole power of unconscious biases, or challenging our unconscious biases, is for us to stop, think, acknowledge. But if we don't stop, where have we got time to think and acknowledge?
This is precisely the problem that I was sort of finding with the world we're living in, which is part of the reason I wanted to write the book, was to really explore this idea of pausing and self-reflecting and thinking about who we are, who we want to be, and how on earth we're meant to do this when we're constantly in this sort of living this mad life where we're not even given the opportunity to stop and think. And you and I have said previously talked previously about the fact that, where does the time go? Where does the time go? And where do we find the time to carve out a space where we can think about our own actions? And I also think we live in quite an accusatory world. You said this to me, I was offended. I said this to you, you were offended. I'm right, you're wrong.
And that's all part of unconscious bias as well, isn't it, Ayisha? Because we come with our own stories, and then I say something, and I don't mean to offend you, whoever the you is. But then that person has got their stories, and then they react. And there's no stopping, thinking, sharing open, honest conversation, or reflecting.
Yeah, and this is exactly, and we all talk about kindness and compassion, but I'm just not seeing very much of it. And what I kind of witness feels like performative compassion and performative kindness, and also kindness and compassion that's only for the people who think the way I think.
That's a very important point that you've put up here. The idea of how we all stay in our own little silos, or our own little groups or communities, or whatever the phrase is, where everyone pats each other on the back.
Mm.
And what we believe is reinforced.
Yeah,
And so,
absolutely.
and how do we break that? I mean, very simply put, I read the newspaper. I'm still old fashioned enough to get a daily paper every day, but I
Mm.
get the same paper 7 days a week. And
Yeah.
it matches my ideas of good and bad, or politics, or
Mm.
how I want the world to live. Now,
Yeah.
clearly, if I want to challenge my thoughts rather than reinforce how I think, I should be buying 6 different types of newspapers, one every day. So I
Absolutely.
get different types of news that
Yeah.
is chucked into my head and makes me think differently. But
Yeah.
to be safe, all I keep doing is same old, and perpetuating what I already know.
But it's also because, I think you and I have quite similar values in terms of our social and political beliefs, but also just the idea of trying to understand, for example, an extreme right wing person is actually quite depressing. In order to address your own biases, you have to go into spaces that are uncomfortable, and that's not easy. And I think part of the reason, um, the inspiration I get for the books that I write is really about exploring that. So my third book, This Green and Pleasant Land, is about a Muslim family living in an English village,
Hmm.
and quite removed from their culture and their faith, until the main character, Bilal, his mother on her deathbed, asks him, because she's fearful of his soul and is scared that he's lost faith and his roots, asks him to build a mosque in this village. And when she dies, he ends up trying to fulfill her wish in honor of his mother, even though he thinks it's a ridiculous idea. Anyway, it ends up becoming a huge thing in this small village, this small community. And one of the antagonists, a white woman who's in her 60s, Shelley Hawking, becomes a sort of leader of the anti-mosque movement, I guess. In this, you see, I'm fond of movements. Village. And it required me to get into the mindset of what it would be for a white woman of a completely different generation to mine, if someone wanted to build a mosque in her dear village in which she's lived her entire life. And it was about unpicking why it might be and where she's coming from, and also hopefully writing it in a way that she doesn't come out as, out and out racist, um, but really trying to understand how difficult it would be for someone like that to navigate such a huge thing.
Well,
Uh,
that's the thing, you see, what you've said is very much about unconscious biases
yeah.
rather than racism.
Yes.
Because when
Yeah.
we talk about people being racist, it's also because they're feeling insecure. Their own status quo is being threatened
Yeah.
or challenged. They have been so comfortable in a particular way, like this lady in a remote white village somewhere in England. Or it could be something else. I've got this job and I've had this job all the time. And now suddenly there's a huge influx, as I'm talking 1971, of people who are South Asian descent, but from East Africa, where
Mm.
when Idi Amin throws them all out and they all arrive here
Yeah.
from Uganda, and they try and get jobs, and they're very hardworking people. But
Yeah.
then if someone's been here who's a white English person who's got a job, they're suddenly worried that these people will come and take my job or my son's job or my daughter's job.
Mm.
And then they feel threatened.
Mm. Mm.
And when they feel threatened, they react. So
Yeah.
that's their story rather than saying, I don't like you because you're brown or black or Muslim or whatever it might
Mm.
be. It's about
Mm.
actually acknowledging why we feel threatened. What is it about us that make me feel uncomfortable, and why am I behaving the way I am? But you're right. It's something that's hard to do and extremely brave.
It's hard, and it's also sort of it sort of feeds into the idea that one, and I'm being very sort of black and white about this, but it feeds into the idea that one community has to be more accommodating for the other community because they feel really uncomfortable. And so it sort of feeds into the idea of, so whose rights trump another's rights, you know, and how do we navigate these different stories and these different experiences so that we can come to a sort of a space in which both parties are comfortable, you know, what do we do there? That's more of a
But what do you do, Ayisha, on a sort of a daily level in terms of challenging your own unconscious biases?
I don't, I mean, I think that sometimes I am told by friends that perhaps what you've said there wasn't necessarily something that you should have said in public. And I'm forced to sort of sit with it and acknowledge that actually, yeah, that I probably shouldn't have said something like that. And I'll give you an example. Actually, just happened over the weekend. One of my best friends and I went to a birthday dinner with a couple of other friends, and this person whose birthday party it was, I don't actually know her very well. Anyway, there was someone there who was telling a story because he drives an ambulance, and he was telling us how someone phoned for an ambulance for themselves, and when the ambulance arrived, you know, it transpired that actually there were 2 or 3 other people in the house who could have driven her to the hospital, her husband and a son or something. And if I remember correctly, what she said was, I called the ambulance because I didn't want to wake, I didn't want to disturb them, I didn't want to wake them up. And it kind of just came out of my mouth, and I was just like, was she brown? And he said, yes, she was. And my friend just gave me daggers. She was
That's
like,
your unconscious bias, Ayisha.
yes,
Classic.
I know,
Classic.
classic. And she looked daggers at me. She said, I love you, but everything you've just said is so problematic.
Oops, whoops. How funny. And I'm happy to announce I wasn't visualizing them as brown people.
Oh God, it was just,
That is so funny, but that's such a classic unconscious bias
I
story that you've
know.
just shared. But
And
but
against
that goes
my
to
own people.
show. No, but
Sorry?
it goes to show that it'll continue all the time, won't it? We're just human beings.
Yeah, we're human beings. But I mean, that's one of the times that, you know, my friend might not have said something. I mean, she might have said something, she would have said, but if my friend wasn't there, someone might not have said something to me, but she was there. So she did say something. And this really pisses her off about me quite regularly because I clearly do it quite often in front of her, especially.
She's a
And
good friend.
she's one of the best. And yeah, it kind of, it, because you know, when someone says to you, you have said something wrong, human nature is to get defensive, you know, because no one wants to be wrong, do they? Everyone wants to feel like everyone wants to feel like they're a good human being. They don't have prejudices, and they don't think negatively about certain groups. But I think that's I think unfortunately, that's just entirely untrue. And also, it's a dangerous place to be because we all have our unconscious biases. Even the most thoughtful person, I think, has their unconscious bias because we're, like you say, we're human, and we're prone to making these mistakes. And so as a result of what she had said to me, I did think, oh yeah, I do a bit. I do give a dig at brown people quite often. Maybe because I think I also have the right to, because I'm brown, right?
Exactly. I was about to say that.
But
You're so right.
how does this
Mm.
feed into social scenarios? You know, those people, half of whom I didn't really know, they're going to go away. The ones who weren't brown, who were white, are going to go away, and I've I've possibly potentially perpetuated these biases.
Exactly what you were saying earlier on in your books, that you mustn't perpetuate these biases,
I did it in
but you did in a
person.
social occasion.
I'm a much better human being in my writing than I am in person, I think.
No, but it's all about reflection, as you correctly said, isn't
Yeah.
it? And it's about being honest with yourself. So, and that's what we all have to do. So, yeah, I completely agree with you, Aisha, that it is about stopping thinking, not constantly running,
Yeah,
um,
constantly running.
and just reflect. Exactly. Give ourselves time. So true.
Yeah, give us, and we also have to be, it's about having people around you who also hold you accountable for what you say. But it's also the manner in which that accountability is delivered.
And the trust you have in that person.
And the trust you have in that person. And if it's someone that you don't know, then, and they want to bring it up, then it's up to that person to deliver it in a way that the person who's in the wrong, or who's maybe made a bit of a faux pas, it's delivered with sort of insight and understanding, so that the other person doesn't get defensive. But this is a real piece of this is hard work, because it also means that you have to be incredibly patient with yourself and with others.
But it's necessary, and I love that you've said that. It's difficult, but we all have to keep at it.
It's so necessary, and it's good to have people in your life who are able to pull you up on that kind of stuff.
Yes,
So
call out to your friend. Thank you. Exactly.
thank you,
We need more. We need more friends like that. Ayisha Malik, thank you so very much for sharing your stories of unconscious bias with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Stories Seldom Told. I am Smitha Tharoor. It is you, the listener, that makes this podcast what it is. If you like this podcast, please do share. If any of you anywhere in the world feel that you have stories to share, please do connect with me on social media at Smitha Tharoor on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, or on my company page, Tharoor Associates, on Facebook. We will be back next week.